For me for actually remembering to press it. And we'll get started. So thank you everybody for coming along today at our unusual time. I'm Kathy and I run Autistic Girls Network, which is a small charity that supports autistic girls and their families. But we do like to talk about a lot of other neurodivergencies. And so today we're going to be learning more about tics and Tourette's. Obviously, there is a big co-occurrence with autism and with tics and Tourette's. So we're going to learn more about that today with Ione from Tourette's Action. Welcome, Ione. I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to those who have joined us today. As Kathy said, today's session is a little bit earlier than the current webinars. We're trying to squeeze it into lunchtime, and that is on me. That's where my brain works best, is in the day, and the session you would have got in the evening would have probably not cut the mustard. So we're going to try in the daytime. It's lovely to meet you all. This is a bit of a brief whistle-stop exploration of all things tics and Tourette's. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Ione Georgakis. I am a children's occupational therapist, and I'm also the therapies and advocacy manager at Tourette's Action UK. And I have Tourette Syndrome, I have ADHD, and I have dyslexia, a variety of neurodivergent diagnoses. And I'll use my kind of lived and my professional experience to run training and awareness sessions on all things kind of tics and Tourette's. I want to make a bit of a disclaimer at this part. The session that I'm going to lead is based on the current evidence base available to me and my knowledge, my experience. And I also understand that it's the typical or the commonly experienced journey of tics and Tourette's, and that not everybody's individual experience, it won't be representative of each individual's experience. You might have an experience that's slightly different than that we are talking about today. You might have had a slightly different journey of your experience of tics and Tourette's, and that's absolutely fine. And we know that that's the case, but this is a general exploration of tics and Tourette's. So this session is going to give us a bit of an intro to what is Tourette syndrome. Lots of us think we know, and some of us do, and some of us might have some misconceptions around the condition. We're going to look at some of the things that impact tics and Tourette's alongside some of the other conditions that we know go hand in hand with the diagnosis. We'll briefly look at the impact on the individual and what support is available for people with tics and Tourette's, and what we can offer as a charity, and then we'll have time for kind of questions and answers at the end. There is no such thing as a silly question. And I also recognise that if there's something you don't want to ask on a recorded webinar, our contact details for the charity are at the end of these slides, and you can reach out to us for kind of a more personal conversation. So before we kind of start today, I encourage you just to take a minute to read and reflect on some of these questions on the slide here. Now, you don't have to put your microphones on or type it in the comment box, but I just want you to have a moment to think about it. Some people might have joined today because they have a family member who has suspected Tourette's or has a diagnosis. Some people are here because they're curious, maybe they want to learn more. But just kind of take a minute. I think lots of people who come into our training sessions come in with a really fixed idea of what Tourette syndrome is, how it might present, how it might look. And we know that often that is based on what we see in the media and on our TV screens, which is absolutely fine. That's where we get lots and lots of our knowledge and our information from in our society. The tricky thing about that is that often, as we know, our TV screens and our media show one really specific experience of a disability or a condition, often on one end of the spectrum, and they don't necessarily give voice or represent the wider experience of a condition. And so that often means that people have this really specific view of what Tourette syndrome is, unless they maybe have lived or experience of it, or they have professional experience of it, or they know or love someone with this beautiful and bizarre condition. So let's get started, because I could wamble on forever. What is Tourette syndrome? So Tourette syndrome is a neurodevelopmental condition. We also might use the term a neurological condition. And we often see this condition run in families. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a direct relative will have Tourette syndrome, but they might have had childhood tics. There might be a relative with another commonly co-occurring diagnosis, and we'll learn what those are in a little while. And there might be, and more likely being the case, that there's a family member who historically had tics, but that were never recognised as Tourette syndrome. I think one thing that we're starting to see is a whole generation of older adults who very, very likely had Tourette syndrome and would have met that diagnostic criteria, but they didn't grow up in a time or a society where those symptoms were recognised as Tourette's. And so I'm really pleased and excited to be, part of the journey, and hopefully raising that awareness for the next generation to have easier access to kind of self-identification, but also formal diagnosis and treatment for this condition should they wish to access it. So this neurodevelopmental condition, the key features of it are tics, which are involuntary sounds and movements. And for a diagnosis of Tourette's, you have to have had multiple movement tics and at least one vocal or sound tic, and they have to have been present for over 12 months. Typically, those symptoms have to have started in childhood too, okay? And they can't be caused by any other factors, nothing like substance misuse or allergies. There's lots of other things that could cause someone to make these small sounds or movements. We have to rule those out. But that is our standard diagnostic criteria. Within that 12 months, we would absolutely be expecting to see tics waxing and waning, kind of coming and going, increasing, decreasing. Lots of people have periods of being completely tic-free within that year. So it's really important that we kind of recognise Tourette's doesn't sit on the same level all the time. Tics fluctuate, as do we as human beings, as does the stress and the excitement and the responsibilities in our lives. So there kind of used to be this idea of, oh, but he's not ticking today, it can't be Tourette's, but that is absolutely not the case. So what are motor and vocal tics? I'm using these words, and unless you are kind of living it or working in this field, you might not actually know. So we like to categorize things. It makes life easier as medical professionals, and it also gives us a language to talk about our sounds and movements. So within Tourette's, we have our motor tics, which are our movement tics, and these can be simple tics, which are single stage movements, and they can be complex tics, which are multi-stage movements. Next, we have our vocal tics or our sound tics or even our phonic tics. And our simple vocal tics are single stage vocalizations or sounds, essentially anything but a word. And our complex tics can be multi-stage sounds, words, vocalizations, and sentences, etc. And we're going to look at what these mean in a little bit more detail. Because in order to sort of compassionately support individuals with tics and Tourette's and to help them to recognise their needs and maybe access diagnosis if that's their aim, we need to know what we're looking out for. And so often during these slides and these sessions, especially when I'm working with parents, they'll say, oh God, I didn't know that could be a tic. And that's something that I correct him for all the time, or I tell him to stop it because I didn't realise it was a tic. It didn't look or sound like his other tics. And that's kind of part of the reason that we do it, in order for us to be aware and to kind of behave in a way that we want and need to, and support people that we love with this condition. We need to know what we're aware of, if that makes any sense. So some of our simple motor tics are kind of included on the left-hand side of the slide here. We've got things like blinking and eye rolling, shrugging the shoulders, jerking the limbs, tensing the abdomen or the head and neck. Now, these are definitely the most common types of tics, and they're often the first types of tics that we see in childhood, okay? They often start quite simple, and they're often around the face and the head and the neck before they start to impact other kind of outer limbs. We call this rostrocaudal distribution, but you don't need to know the word for it to make sense. Essentially, starts central and works its way out across the body. It's obviously not always the rule for everybody, but typically, especially in early childhood, these are the tics we see first. Now, one thing I like to highlight here is that some of these tics, these are tics that often people will assume have a relatively low impact or might be quite mild or undisruptive, but it's important to recognise that actually isn't always the case. So things like eye blinking and eye rolling tics can really frequently cause pain, difficulty reading, and actually eye rolling tics specifically are one of a small handful of tics that can impair someone's driving and stop someone from being able to safely drive. And I think we can understand why But it's tricky because such a simple tic can have a massive social consequence, can't it? Suddenly you can't drive for that period of time. You're waiting for that tic to go. But some of these tics are also going on inside the body. So we've got abdominal tensing and things like buttock clenching or scrunching the toes that are happening inside the shoe. We might not see some of these tics. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be accommodating for them. It doesn't mean that they're not still distracting. It doesn't mean that they're not still tiring, or causing pain. So I think it's just important to recognize it's not only the tics that we can see. Next, we have our complex motor tics. So these are multi-stage movements. They involve multiple steps or multiple muscle groups. And these tics can cause quite a lot of kind of occupational or functional disruption or interruption. They can stop people from doing the things that they want and need to. So I think, we think about things like jumping and twirling, how much those big body movements would interrupt your kind of your flow, your movement, your activity. Things like throwing tics, I work with people who have gone through like 8 phones over the course of this year, and they have these big JCB phone protectors on, and these covers and cases, but they still their tics are so frequent and so violent or so sneaky that they still struggle with these items. And these tics can also really easily be misinterpreted on a kind of social level. So things like touching objects and other people, throwing things. There's not only this physical consequence for the individual, but there can also be a social impact for some of these tics. Next, we have our simple vocal tics, or our sound or our phonic tics. And these are kind of any vibration that comes from the vocal cord. Some examples here are kind of whistling, throat clearing, coughing, tongue clicking, grunting, and animal sounds. These are very common vocal tics, and they may happen, hundreds and hundreds of times a day for some people. And again, I just encourage people to kind of check their assumptions around these tics. These are tics that people can often assume to be relatively non-impactful. However, when we think about, there's a really big role of the environment and the context for these tics. So just as my body showed there. So a wolf whistling tic, it's a very common tic, a whistling of any sort. It's a tic that I've had for years and years and years, and I always confuse builders because they suddenly think, oh, why is that young woman objectifying me? And I don't mean to, sorry, on you go with your day. But I've just come back from a lovely holiday in Croatia, and the wolf whistling tic went from a tic that I really, really don't mind. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't cause me pain. It doesn't really cause me much social embarrassment. I don't really have an issue with it. But suddenly on the beach, that tic became so much harder to handle or to live with or to kind of explain to people. And then you add a language barrier, and you add lots of different age individuals on the beach. And suddenly this tic that I'm generally quite grateful to have over some of the other tics that might cause me some pain or distraction was a tic that I was really desperate to not be experiencing. So context is everything, environment is everything, scenario, situation is everything. And so kind of placing our assumptions on the impact of a tic or the consequence of a tic is really, really tricky, and we should always avoid doing that. And then we have our complex vocal tics. So these can be words, these can be phrases, sounds, speaking in accent, sentences, and singing. And just as the name suggests, these tics can be really, really complex in nature, and sometimes they can be really, really hard to spot as tics. So tics kind of vary from person to person. We know that tics can very easily be on a subconscious, unconscious level, be triggered or influenced by the person's environment, sometimes even around things that they haven't necessarily consciously registered or seen, but that they've sort of picked up. And these tics have massive social consequences. They can really easily be misinterpreted as purposeful speech. Some people's tics might be more rapid. They might be at a louder volume or a different tone or pitch than their purposeful speech. And in that case, it can be slightly easier to recognize them. Other people's tics can quite easily get masked into their regular speech, into their regular speech pattern, and therefore it can be harder to spot. There is kind of no limit to the range of complex vocal tics. They can be as diverse as, as humankind. There's such a beautiful array of them. People I've worked with, you know, have had every tic under the sun. They can be really, 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 really complex. And I often have people say to me, you know, professionals often, well, there's no way that that was a tic. It was, you know, it was just too well timed, or if it really fit the scenario. It absolutely can be a tic. So really do not assume that. And if you're unsure, ask, you know, was that a tic and do I need to respond? Or, you know, or did you mean to tell me that? And I also kind of use your wisdom and your judgment in that. If someone meows in the middle of a conversation, it probably doesn't warrant a response, you know, regardless. It's just a sound. If someone shouts, I quit in the middle of the interaction that you're having, then yeah, you might need to clarify, was that a tic or are you actually handing in your notice? So just kind of use some common sense, use some curiosity, use some compassion. Now we've looked at kind of our core standard tics here, our motor and our vocal tics, our simple and our complex. And now I just want to touch on some other kind of features of tics within Tourette's. And these are features of other neurodivergent diagnoses. So you might be familiar with some of these terms already. But the first one that we're going to talk about here is echo phenomena. And just as the name suggests, this is echoing other people's sounds and it's echoing other people's movements, okay? And in Tourette syndrome, we break this down into kind of these two areas. So we have echopraxia, which is repeating other people's movements and gestures. So I, for example, have a tendency to tic a waving response. If I see somebody in my environment waving at someone, I don't know them, you know, it's not to them. And I'll often try and sort of hide it because I have this moment where I don't know you and you don't know me, but we're both suddenly waving at each other. That's an example of an echopraxic movement. And then we have our echolalia, okay, and that is repeating other people's words or phrases. And this is a really common feature of lots of neurodivergent diagnoses, and also kind of to some extent of just humankind. You know, we all have this tendency to have like an advert jingle that goes over and over in our head. But for individuals with Tourette's or individuals with echolalia, these sounds might be coming out as involuntary verbal tics. What I will mention here is that there's a lot of complex social implications for some of these echolalic tics. So I work with lots of people who have the amazing capacity to, their echolalic tics are in the exact tone, pitch, kind of volume, speed as the original soundbite. So, or the original sentence or word that they have heard and that their brain is repeating. And that can include things like accents, and that can have really significant social consequences. And people are saying, oh my goodness, I keep repeating it back to them, and I'm doing it in his voice and his pitch and his, you know, in his mannerisms. And I don't mean to, it's just the nature of my tic. It's really common for these tics to be around songs, TV, catchphrases, etc. So one that I have is I Go by Toyota, sponsors T4. And I've had that tic since I was probably like 13, 14. I don't think T4 is even still on television, but I will say that probably, I don't know, five, 6, 7 times a week, 15 years on. So these tics can live rent-free in your brain for a very, 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 very long time. Now, next we have our pala phenomena, okay? So very similar to echo phenomena, but in these tics, you're repeating your own sounds and your own movements, okay? So we have palapraxia, praxia being movement. And this is where you're repeating your own gestures. And this can really feel like kind of getting stuck. So it can just often be with quite a simple repetitive movement, and people can feel like they're getting stuck. I worked with someone who used to pull hand towels, and you'd say, well, they haven't come back from the toilet for a minute. I'm just going to go and check that they're okay. And you go and knock on the door, and they'd be by the sinks, and they'd just be in a mound of hand paper tissues. And they say, could you? And yeah, okay. I'm just going to put my hand in front of that tissue to give you a minute to pause there. But that's an example of a palapraxic movement or gesture. And then we have palalalia, lalia being speech. And this is repeating your own words or phrases. And this can very much sound like a stutter. However, it's often the whole word that's being repeated. So it might be, you know, shall we go for a run, 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 run? And those tics can obviously be quite frustrating for people. They can struggle to get their words out, and sometimes want support with that. Now, just to kind of wrap up this section, last but absolutely not least, we have our copro phenomena. Okay, so Coprophenomena is, without a doubt, the most widely associated symptom of tics and Tourette's in our society, and it is essentially the involuntary expression of unacceptable words or gestures, swearing. Okay, so within this feature, we have copropraxia, which is obscene or offensive gestures, i.e. giving the middle finger, and coprolalia, which is offensive words or phrases. Okay, so kind of the verbal side of it. It's really important that we kind of highlight here that this symptom of Tourette's impacts the minority of the Tourette's community, okay? An estimate of 15 to 20%. And for lots of people, it's not a permanent symptom. It's a feature that they might experience during a period of their life, possibly around kind of late adolescence, and then it may kind of tweedle off. It might impact the minority of the Tourette's community, but it's certainly the tic, in my opinion, that have some of the biggest social emotional consequences. It's the tics that often stop people from feeling safe, kind of accessing their community, accessing school or work. We also know that individuals with the most severe tics are more likely to develop coprophenomena. It's quite unusual for coprophenomena to emerge after teenage years, but it does happen in certain cases. And people with the highest rate of co-occurring difficulties are the greatest likelihood for developing these symptoms. So although they don't impact the majority of the community, they have the biggest social impact or consequence, and it's most likely to occur in individuals with the most severe presentation and the most kind of the higher rates of co-occurring differences. So it's really important we give voice to these symptoms, but also recognise that it's not the only part of Tourette's that we should be considering or thinking about or giving voice to. And that's because even nowadays we have people who come to us and say, I've gone to the GP or I've gone to a medical professional about possible Tourette's diagnosis, and they've said, but he's not swearing, it can't be Tourette's. The idea that in 2024 that's still such a deeply ingrained misconception is heartbreaking to me. However, we're hoping to kind of allow people to recognise the reality. It's a very real and very challenging part of the condition for those who live with it, but it's not everybody's experience. And if we only represent this side of the condition, we do all of the other people a disservice, people who are looking for their representation on the screen and their representation in the media. So we've looked at some of the kind of the features of this beautiful and bizarre condition. Let's look at the prevalence and some of the statistics. So Tourette's impacts around 1% of the international population. It presents across all nationalities, populations, genders, races, ages. There's a kind of a newly emerging organisation called Tics and Tourette's around the globe. And they are bringing kind of Tourette's associations from all over the world, including spaces that they haven't got their own associations yet, together to share support and ideas and resources. And Tourette's Action have recently become a part of their kind of organisation and one of their supporters, which we're very, very excited about, sharing kind of equity and support internationally. There are an estimated 300,000 people in the UK living with Tourette syndrome. It's actually likely to be much higher because of rates of mis or underdiagnosis, but it's not a rare condition. And I think that's one of the big myths that surround Tourette syndrome. And in school-age children, Tourette's impacts around 1 in 100 school-age children. And actually recent studies out of the US suggest this could be as high as 1 in 50. And so it's a very, 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 very prevalent disorder in childhood, but also throughout the lifespan. And kind of on that note, let's look at that kind of Tourette's timeline, trajectory, journey. So tics typically start in early childhood, around the ages of kind of 4 to 6 years old. Movement seen before then, we'd be cautious to kind of call it, definitely a tic. Tics tend to peak in severity in adolescence. I think adolescence, we can all empathise, is an incredibly difficult time for a variety of reasons. There are lots and lots of hormone changes going on in that time. There's a real wish to kind of fit in and to to not stand out for reasons outside of your control. You know, you want to kind of stand out for the reasons that you want to stand out, for your clothes, for your music, for your hairstyle, but not necessarily for something that feels really, really out of your control, because that can make you feel very vulnerable. You're in a kind of busy space. And as we know, essentially through adolescence and through childhood, really, we are constantly putting people in boxes, and we're giving them all these kind of prescriptive requirements. If somebody told me nowadays that I had to change office every hour, change the task that I was doing every hour, that I had to sit still and listen, you know, for every hour within that working day, back to back, I'd say, no, I quit, but thank you so much for the offer. But we do that to our children. We put them in school systems and environments that aren't designed for them, that don't accommodate their individual differences, that don't allow them to get the sensory movement and opportunity for regulation that we really, really, really need to learn as a neurotypical, let alone as somebody with a neurodevelopmental difference. So I think that there's just a whole host of reasons why tics are kind of at their peak, often in adolescence. And then around 50% of cases reduce into adulthood. Okay, so there used to be a bit of a myth that Tourette's was a childhood condition, that it only impacted children, and this is partly why. However, it's really important that we recognise that over half of people are still going to have a continuation of their tics into adulthood. And of the 50% whose tics reduce, many of those individuals report a resurgence of these childhood tics during stressful times. Tics re-emerge in kind of job transitions, stressful periods, they're getting married, they're having a child. So the idea that kind of you'll grow out of it, I think not only does it do our children and young people a disservice, but it also does our adult Tourette population a disservice, and kind of perpetuates the idea that once your tics are gone, that's it, they're gone. And that just isn't the case for many people. The other thing that I think that possibly we will start to see, or that we'll start to better understand, is that maybe as people grow older, they become more accustomed and more able to suppress or to mask some of their tics and some of the physically uncomfortable sensations that come before tics, that are kind of the reason that we tend to tic. And I mean, personally, in my experience throughout the trajectory of my life, I've become much more adept at suppressing my tics, at holding my tics in for a relatively significant period of time in a kind of clinical setting, or kind of redirecting my tics and movements as a less noticeable kind of sound or movement or gesture. And that's kind of happened naturally throughout the course of my life. And I wonder whether this is something that lots and lots of adults experience. They get better at tolerating that uncomfortable feeling, that uncomfortable urge, just like in childhood. You know, if you need the loo, you need the loo immediately. You need a wee, you've got to go. Whereas in adulthood, you might notice, oh, I've got a twinge in my bladder and I possibly need the loo soon, but you can probably delay it, you can probably hold it in, you can probably ignore that physical discomfort for a period of time until you can get to a toilet. Please don't do that. But this is just one example of how, as we get older, we become more able to kind of tolerate some of these uncomfortable physical feelings that are often so linked with tics in Tourette's. So, contributing factors. Tourette's, like loads of other neurodivergent conditions, sits on a spectrum of severity from mild to incredibly debilitating symptoms. And it's really important that you remember that the Tourette's you see in one person is very likely to differ to the Tourette's that you will see in another person. So we know that there are natural individual differences in the Tourettic experience. Some people have, if we think back to that diagnostic criteria and we think back to some of our motor and our vocal tics, some people might have tics in which they have they raise their eyebrows, they scrunch their nose, they clear their throat, and that, present for over a year, is Tourette's in one person. So hello, John, that's your picture of Tourette's. And then we have on another individual, we have jumping and twirling tics, we have shouting full words and sentences, we have tics which are kind of throwing the head and neck back, tics that may be impacting the legs and the ankles, so safe mobility, the ability to eat food, the ability to read information because of how frequent or severe or violent their tics are. So it doesn't look the same on everybody. And with beyond that individual difference, there are loads of internal and external factors which can impact tic severity over the course of a person's life. the course of a person's day or month. Just as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I always opt to do my training in the morning or in the afternoon, because that's when I function best. And by the time it gets to the early evening, my tics are much more prominent. My capacity to suppress them is reduced, and my other kind of neurodivergent symptoms can be more prominent too. So there's kind of so many different differences and fluctuations within the Tourette's experience, alongside periods of just naturally reduced tics for no reason. It's just the nature of tics and Tourette's. It's constantly changing. But we do know that there are some things which are essentially kind of widely accepted to impact tics in the research and the literature, and kind of more importantly, in what people are telling us in the day-to-day. So I'm going to talk about here increasing and decreasing tics. I'm just going to make a note. I always use the language increased tics and decreased tics where possible. Sometimes I don't mindfully speak, and that's an error. But the goal for this is to move away from the idea of your tics being better or worse. And that's because so many young people I work with have come where that language has been used repeatedly with them throughout the course of their life. And they really have kind of internalize this idea that when their tics are high in frequency, that their tics are bad, and when they're not having many tics, that their tics are really good. And in doing that, they start to feel that they're doing badly when their tics are severe and really present, and that they're not doing that they're doing really well when their tics are very settled or infrequent. And I personally, as a practitioner and as someone who lives with this experience, I want us to try and move away from this idea, because it's damaging. I suppose I feel it's damaging. Anyway, what can increase our tics? Excitement. So I always start with this one, and that's because I think as healthcare professionals, as parents, as individuals, as human beings, essentially, we have a tendency to attribute an increase in symptoms to a negative emotion. So the amount of times people say to me, "Oh my goodness, you're quite ticky, you're right, you're a bit stressed or anxious," and absolutely sometimes I am. But more often than not, and what for me is more of an uncontrollable tic trigger, is excitement, joy, anticipation, adrenaline, and all the wonderful feelings that come with something that we're looking forward to. Those things often increase my tics to the point of being kind of unsuppressible or unredirectable, not negative emotions, or not only negative emotions. Talking about tics increases tics in the short term, in that moment. Okay, possibly I'm in the wrong profession, but what can we do? Being around other people who tic, similarly, tics are very suggestible. They're easily influenced by the environment around kind of viewing other people. It's almost that phenomenon, don't think of the red car. Don't think of the red car. We're all sat here thinking of the red car. Don't think of your tics. Don't think of your tics. Well, now I'm thinking of my tics, and I'm thinking of my tic urges, and I'm thinking of what my body wants to do while it's talking to you. Of course, on here, we also have stress and anxiety, and these can be a really big trigger for tics and for any other kind of physical symptom or neurodevelopmental presentation. Being over or understimulated, not having too much to do, too many tasks, too many demands placed on you, too much noise, too much sensory information, or on the other hand, not having enough of a challenge, not having enough opportunities to move, not having enough opportunities to regulate. So kind of either extreme end of this spectrum. We know that lots of individuals with Tourette's have strong sensory processing differences. And I think for many people, it's these sensory changes, the anxiety that comes with being really overwhelmed that can increase their tics significantly. Similarly, busy environments where there's 101 people that you're worried about shocking, distracting, offending, touching, that they're being too busy, that they might have a really strong smell to them, that they might have a demographic or a feature that triggers your tics, and you really want to avoid that interaction. There's a whole host of reasons. And being tired, feeling really exhausted and having less in your cup to manage those physical feelings and those sensations. And on the other side of things, we have things that can decrease our tics. Okay, so there are formal therapy approaches for tics and Tourette's, kind of modified behavioural interventions. There are medication interventions, there are kind of mindfulness, etc. But these are kind of more of a activity-based and social approaches to decreasing tics. And the first one is feeling relaxed and accepted. You know, if you're in a space where everyone gets it, they really get it, they know it's not what you mean to do or say, they're not going to bring loads of mad attention to your sounds or movements, they're not going to keep questioning you on kind of what was that noise or who did that or can you really not stop. They're just kind of letting you be. In those environments, you are going to feel more regulated, safer, and less likely to tic. It's simply the nature of it. And if you are ticking lots, you're going to be less likely to be bothered by those tics, because so often the kind of the distress or the bother that comes with tics are based around other people's poor responses, or other people's kind of, poor responses. Low stimulus spaces, controlled environments can be really, really, really helpful for kind of decreasing tics. Spaces where you understand the environment, that there's not going to be kind of a sudden unpredictable demand placed on you. There's not going to be a sudden loud alarm going on. You know, this is my space. I've curated it. I've made it work for me. Let's go. No tic consequences. You know, knowing you're not going to be told off, punished, shamed, embarrassed about your tics makes you less likely to tic. You know, I often give the example here of an airport. That's a space where there are massive tic consequences. And I've worked with and supported people in airports who have really, really, really challenging tics in those spaces. But there's such a high consequence to those tics. They could miss their flight. They could be removed from the flight. They could have an unpleasant stop and search experience. And the consequences are so high that the likelihood of those tics coming out increases massively because they're so tense and anxious about that happening. Focused activities, okay, or kind of exercise and activities. Now, I'm an occupational therapist, so I'm majorly biased, but this is one of my favorite kind of features of Tourette's, or kind of facets of Tourette's. It's almost a hallmark feature of the diagnosis that lots and lots and lots of people will have a period of almost tic-free time, or a really significant reduction in their tics when they're engaged in certain focused activities or tasks, leisure occupations. And there are as many activities as there are people with Tourette's, but some really common ones that I come across are things like playing music, you know, singing, playing sports, crochet, reading, driving for some people, dancing. It's just such a wide array of activities. But people's focus, their attention, their flow, their bodily attention, their neurological attention goes on that task. And in doing so, the attention on their body, etc., reduces, and as do their tics. And so if you're working with someone or living with someone with this condition, help them find their thing, help them find their kind of their tic-free space and activity that gives them a break from it and that allows them to kind of have an outlet for some of those other strengths and skills. Adjusting the sensory environment is incredibly important. For me, I think it's one of the biggest benefits, you know, or biggest kind of self-help strategies that I've used in my life, is working out what I need to regulate my sensory system and implementing that as effectively as I can, and then finding ways to reduce sensory overwhelm in certain environments that I can't control, like the supermarket. That might be listening to music, it might be using fidgets, it might be making sure that if I'm doing something that's really difficult for me, I've had some exercise or some movement that morning to help me to stay kind of regulated and focused. And also mindfulness and relaxation can help decrease tics. And I whisper that because every time I say it to someone, they just roll their eyes at me or tell me stop swearing, you know, because no one really wants to know about it. And people find it really, really difficult to put mindfulness and relaxation into practice often, or they can certainly, especially with our busy neurodivergent brains. But there is an evidence base for its benefit, and it can be helpful for those who are able to access it or to tolerate it, or think about it. Okay, so we know there are kind of individual differences in tics and Tourette's, and we know that there are some things that are kind of accepted to impact tic severity. Now, we've talked a little bit about this idea of kind of holding tics in and masking tics, and I want to tell you a bit more about that. So in Tourette syndrome, you know, we might have heard the term masking in the autistic community around people kind of attempting to behave in a way that they are expected to, or that they've been told, that they're made to feel that it's expected of them. In tics and Tourette's, we call this suppression, the suppression of the tic, the sound or the movement. So in Tourette's, around 90% of people with Tourette's will have what we call a premonitory urge, which is an uncomfortable physical feeling, which comes before the tic and is then temporarily relieved when the tic happens. So you might think of it as, you know, when you can feel that sneeze building and you're going, oh, and your eyes are going and you can feel it and feel it and feel it and coming. And sometimes you might be able to distract yourself and that sneeze urge might go away and then it might come back again. Other times you just have to sneeze. And it's quite similar in tics and Tourette's. So lots of people will have this pressure, this urge, this feeling, this, you know, the tic will come out and then it might be relieved for a minute and they might have to have it again. Some people are getting those urges a handful of times a day. Other people have this almost constant physical urge, and that kind of accounts for the difference in symptoms. Now, the difficulty with this is that, or not the difficulty, one of the factors of there being a tic urge is that it means that some people for a period of time are able to hold in or suppress their tics. In doing so, what they're really doing is ignoring that tic urge and trying to distract themselves from it and carry on in order to kind of not stand out, in order to not be picked on, in order to not disrupt, in order to not feel embarrassed, for a whole host of reasons. And research tells us that, you know, people do this because of social pressures primarily. The difficulty with suppression of tics, you know, suppression of tics, it can be a tool. It can be helpful for people to feel safe, to access the world around them. It can be helpful for people to access certain facets of their job role or their child rearing tasks or the kind of the demands that the world has placed on them. If it's a choice, if it's an obligation, if it's something you feel that you have to do or you're being told you have to do, then it's absolutely not a tool. It's a punishment and it's really unethical. It has to be done in the right way if it's something you choose to use, because you know, suppression is linked with what we call a bit of a rebound effect, and that is essentially a build-up of unexpressed tics throughout the day because you've been holding it in. You're sick of, you know, teachers asking you what that noise is. You don't want to draw attention to yourself in the corridor. Your leg tic is stopping you from being able to do PE properly, so you're trying really hard to stop that tic, and you get home at the end of the day, you have this rebound of really big sounds and movements and tics, really frequent tics. And it stops you from having that kind of that occupational balance. You can't rest or play after school. You can't spend time with your children. You might not be able to cook or go to the gym because you're having a whole day's worth of tics in your downtime. And I just don't think that that is the message that we want to be sending to people. Not only can kind of holding in your tics have this consequence of a rebound, but it can also be really distracting for you. So I'll often say to someone, if I'm suppressing my tics, you're probably getting around 30% of me and my personality, my cognitive function, my real authentic presence in that interaction, because I'm focusing so heavily on the kind of this anxiety around what might come out, or kind of trying to put up with that uncomfortable physical feeling so I don't confuse or shock you or whatever it might be that underlying anxiety is, but that you're not getting the best out of me. Not only is it physically tiring, but it's also very mentally tiring, and like I said, is often done for social pressures. Now, some people use this as a tool to not only kind of manage their day-to-day function, suppression, but also to manage tic-related pain, which is an incredibly common experience in the Tourette community. Now, one thing I will just quickly mention here is that there's this idea of kind of conscious suppression. You're trying really hard to hold your tics in, so you don't shout something at this football match or on this train or at the supermarket or in the lesson, whatever it might be. But there's also this idea of unconscious suppression. So people with kind of tics and Tourette's have often grown up in a system, in a society where they have constantly been corrected or told to stop that, or they've been actually told, no, you're fine, tick away, you do what you need to. But what they've learned is that it's okay until it isn't. You know, you're free to tick until you say something that's incredibly offensive. You're free to tick until it's racist. You're free to tick until you tick about someone, your boss, you know. So they might have had all of these unseen experiences that mean that they don't actually feel safe to tick in that space. And if that's the case, it's important that we provide environments, kind of social as well as physical environments, where people can be themselves. They can take themselves away to release some of that suppressed energy if they need to, but they can also be allowed to kind of slowly and safely feel, actually, this is a space where I can be me. So that's suppression in a nutshell. It's a really complicated thing. It's a tool but it's a tool that shouldn't be abused or misused, I suppose. And I always pop this little reflection slide here. You know, how long could you tolerate some of these physical sensations without being uncomfortable or distracted or distressed? And if the answer is not for very long, then we don't want to encourage or kind of support people or in short, make people suppress their tics for our comfort. Now, we've looked at lots and lots and lots of areas of tics and Tourette's here. I just want to touch on some of the things that come alongside tics and Tourette's, okay? So pure Tourette's is very, very rare. Only around 12% of people will have pure Tourette's. Most of us have co-occurring conditions or secondary disabilities alongside our Tourette's or as a consequence of our Tourette's. We often use this iceberg model. The motor and the vocal tics are often what we can see and hear, and therefore what we can accommodate for. But there's so much more going on under the surface. And these kind of co-occurring differences can be more challenging than the tics themselves, or they can perpetuate and kind of increase the tics themselves. So often in a therapeutic directive, we might be thinking, how can we support you to manage some of these secondary symptoms or co-occurring conditions before we look at the tics themselves? Because if you have really high untreated, unmanaged anxiety or OCD that are feeding into your tics, that are kind of incorporating into your tics, you're going to be really unlikely to kind of succeed in tic management or reducing your tics, because there's literally this fire fueling that restless energy, fueling that. And so you'll see here, over 50% of individuals have co-occurring ADHD, have OCD. I had quite significant childhood OCD, and that was something that very, very, very much interlinked with my Tourette's, and lots of the kind of compulsions that I had were around physical movements that I had to do in a certain way in order to get on with my day. Much higher rates of anxiety kind of organically, and also as a social consequence of this condition that isn't so well understood yet and accepted. There's a kind of wide range of estimate statistics on the rates of autism spectrum conditions within tics and Tourette's. We haven't got the definitive answer yet, but it's much more likely to be at the higher end of that estimate. High levels of sensory processing differences, difficulties with sleep, emotional dysregulation and rage attacks, and pain at nearly 100%. So people often kind of say, well, how Tourette's, pain? Tell me more. The motor tics, especially even some of those simple motor tics, can happen upwards of hundreds of times a day for some individuals. And if they've had their tics since they were 6 and they're now 60, I can't even do the maths for how often that movement may have occurred, that sound, that gesture may have occurred. We know the term tennis elbow because, a sportsman, they're practicing for a few hours a day, a few days a week, and this is this repetitive strain from this one specific muscle group. Well, I talk about Tourette's elbow. Someone might have been doing that. They might be doing that for 8 to 10 hours a day, every day of their life, and they've been doing that for 10, 15 years plus. It has a real cumulative impact on the body, definitely. So we really got to give voice to that experience of pain. We also know that although Tourette's is not a mental health condition, it is closely linked with mental health and can have a really big impact on mental health. So there are higher rates of kind of mental health conditions in the Tourette's population. There is also stigma associated with the diagnosis, increased vulnerability for sort of self-injurious tics and behaviours. And sadly, there is an increased risk of completing suicide with a Tourette's diagnosis. So we're working really, really, really hard as a charity to kind of raise awareness and to help make the world a little bit of a safer and more inclusive space for our beautiful Tourette community. To wrap up this section, when you've met one person with Tourette's, you've met one person with Tourette's. Tourette's is in green. We should replace this with any comparable neurodivergent diagnosis, disability, difference, feature, and have the same blooming philosophy. Take an individual and unique approach to all factors here. So just to wrap up this section, I want to just touch on some of the incredible strengths of the Tourette's community. Historically, we place so much emphasis on deficit, the things with certain diagnoses might not be able to do, might struggle with. And actually, instead, we should be focusing on and harnessing the strengths and skills of our kind of neurodivergent community wherever possible. And we know that they are innovative, quick thinkers, adaptable, empathetic, creative, resilient, approachable, strong-minded, and beyond. And I think we need to help give voice to some of these strengths and skills from a much earlier stage, because certainly our neurodivergent children are getting a lot more negative feedback in lessons and sessions than their neurotypical counterparts and kind of peers. And also, you know, we know that that can continue on throughout adult life in a world, in a society that is built and designed primarily for neurotypical individuals. We need to help people to appreciate what they're doing incredibly well. We do have challenges that are linked with the condition, and it's important we give voice to it. We don't kind of always have this kind of shiny, happy, everything's wonderful lens. And we've kind of looked at those throughout the course of today's session. And I think a really big one is the physical pain that's linked with Tourette's. People often say, you know, if you could take a magic pill and get rid of your Tourette's, would you? And I'd like to be one of those people who say, you know, no, I wouldn't. And most of the time, Tourette's brings, you know, has very few negative consequences for me, but the physical pain of tics can be a real challenge for people to live with, and we should give voice to that. Alongside the kind of the social stigma and the challenges in accessing services, managing co-occurring needs, and very limited post-diagnosis support. So I want to wrap up with some myth busting to kind of cover some of the things that we've talked about today. So we know that some of the myths that surround this condition perpetuate some of these challenges. So it causes underdiagnosis. You know, if we don't know how to spot Tourette's, how can we diagnose Tourette's? It can cause stigma around the condition. It can cause shame for the individual who doesn't see their experience represented. And it can misrepresent the real authentic experience of Tourette's. And we want people to be accepted for the awesome people that they are. And I think that one way we do that is to myth bust. So Tourette's only affects males. This is a big old myth. Now, Tourette's is more common in the male sex, but we know it affects both sexes. And there are underlying factors which can impact these kind of this difference in diagnosis. Often we know the males are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, and that is a space where often tics are recognised in clinic environments. We also know that we're starting to see emerging research that indicates that males might have more tics in early childhood and less in later years, whereas women might have less tics in childhood and more in later years. So it might follow a different trajectory alongside other factors like hormones and kind of social differences. So we're hoping that this gap will actually close in time. We know now that not everybody with Tourette's swears, and that not everybody with Tourette's will grow out of it. We should not only focus on the tics we see, because we know that there are internal and invisible tics which can be just as painful or distracting. And we are trying incredibly hard as a charity, as a society, to move away from this really outdated narrative that Tourette's is funny and that it should be used as a punchline and that it's acceptable to do that. It is absolutely not. We don't do it for comparable disabilities and differences. Why are we doing it for Tourette's? We know it's not rare, it's incredibly common internationally, and it is not a behavioural condition. It is not poor parenting, it is not people being disrespectful or impulsive, it is a neurodevelopmental difference. It's certainly not what the person thinks or feels or believes. It's not their philosophy, their theology, and do not hold someone accountable for the context or the comments of their verbal tics, because it isn't them. Always try and be patient, talk to the individual to recognise kind of how they want to be supported, do your research, be an advocate for the community, because people have often been advocating for themselves their whole life. We have a range of resources on our website which can help people post-diagnosis. You know, the internet can be a terrifying place when you're researching a condition, and there can be loads of misinformation out there. So especially for children and young people, I really encourage you to focus on safe resources that have been created with an evidence base and that have been created and kind of vetted. And as a charity, we are always here to help. So we have a help desk service that's manned by volunteers and staff who can offer kind of advice and support. We do training for schools, for businesses, for employers. So to help you throughout the lifespan, we have tic attack passports and Tourette's passports where you can record your symptoms and your needs. We offer grants for specialist equipment for up to £500 for people with the condition who might need a piece of equipment or a tool to improve their well-being and enhance their lives. We offer online and face-to-face support groups. We have a Tourette's ID card. We have kind of guidance on employment and education, lived experience stories, and a newsletter. So please contact us. if you're living with Tourette's, if you suspect you have Tourette's, if you need some support in school, in work, or beyond. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and I would welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Ione. That was fantastic. I personally learned loads. That was absolutely brilliant. And it was really interesting just how many, you know, how many parallels there are, I guess you could say. And, you know, I'm sure we're going to find that with all kinds of different types of neurodivergencies. If you do have a question, let me just open up the chat because I haven't got it open. Oh, we do have a couple of questions already. So there's a question about functional neurological disorder. What are the similarities of that with Tourette's?
Yeah, really good question. So functional neurological disorder or functional movement disorders can have a lot of kind of crossover. Lots of the symptoms can be motor and vocal tics. And we know that kind of the crossover there is often that those tics can be exacerbated by stress and by anxiety, but that their cause and their onset are different, and therefore the management strategies for them are different. So from a professional standpoint, it's really important that we get the diagnosis right. Lots of people come to me with a diagnosis of Tourette's, and actually when we look at their journey, it's much more likely that it's a functional tic disorder, and as a consequence of that incorrect diagnosis, they're getting the wrong support and intervention. But we do know that, you know, the tics that are experienced in functional neurological disorder present very much like the tics in Tourette's, but often at a more severe end of the spectrum. They can still be very kind of violent. They can cause injury to the self and to others. They may benefit from kind of relaxation, mindfulness, anxiety management strategies. And certainly in my experience, Alison, in my professional experience, sensory support and sensory plans can be some of the most supportive, protective, that kind of cohort of people who are experiencing those symptoms. Yeah. And also, you know, you can have both. That's worth mentioning. Lots of people have Tourette syndrome diagnosis, but they may also have some functional tics alongside those as well. It's, you know, it's not one and the same. And similarly with stereotypies and stims, you can have all three. We don't always, as long as we know what movements are what, we don't have to have one or the other. But yeah, I hope that answers.
That's really tough, Alison, if she's in hospital for days at a time, is there non-stop. Ione, is there anyone not anyone, is there any particular kind of service that you might signpost to in that case?
Yeah, so I believe there's a charity called FND Hope that offer kind of support and information and resources around functional neurological disorder. I think they've got a bit of like a school plan that can be used around kind of creating a plan for functional neurological disorder. And often we'd recommend accessing some support via kind of psychology or CAMS if it's available in your area. But I know that it can almost be a joke these days, isn't it? If it's available in your area, if you can wait the 4 years or whatever it might be to see a professional, but it's certainly worth exploring that. Lots of other people find that managing underlying anxiety medically and kind of a behavioral therapy strategy can be just as impactful as kind of looking at the tics and the symptoms themselves for functional neurological disorder. You don't want to be addressing the tics before you've addressed the underlying kind of driver and cause of it, because we don't want to set people up to fail.
Okay, and again, the similarities with autism. Okay, so Michelle has a question. Who can diagnose tics?
Fabulous. Yeah, really good question. So kind of GPs are the initial gatekeeper, and that's always who you'd go to first, and you get it on record. And we know that tics have to have been present for over a year for that diagnosis. So if you're at the beginning of that journey, get to your GP now, get it on record. A range of professionals can diagnose Tourette syndrome. I mean, technically GPs, but generally they want other things to be ruled out first. So normally it's a neurologist, a neuropsychiatrist, a psychiatrist, and in some sort of situations it might be an MDT of professionals. So some CAMS teams will diagnose, some neurodevelopmental teams will diagnose, some paediatricians will diagnose, some adult neurologists will diagnose, and neuropsychiatrists and psychiatrists. So there is a whole host of professionals who can, in theory, diagnose. I think what the challenge is finding a service that accepts referrals for Tourette's in your area. It can often be classically quite a bounce back scenario. You know, psychiatry are saying, oh no, it's CAMS, and CAMS are going, oh no, it's PEDS, and PEDS are going, oh no, it's, I don't even know who they think it's for. So it can be quite a bounce around process, but start with your GP. On our website, we have a guide to seeing a professional kind of section, and it's got forms. You can record your symptoms, some reflective questions that you're likely to be asked in that first appointment. So kind of when you do go into that space, you feel best prepared. We know most people with Tourette's are diagnosed and discharged in the same appointment. There's very, very little follow-up care. So people put a lot of merit on this magical diagnosis, and it is really important to have a diagnosis for identity and community. But after that diagnosis, I think is where people can feel quite let down, that there isn't this beautiful kind of clear support or intervention plan for them. But it doesn't mean that people shouldn't seek that diagnosis and that community. Good luck with it if that is the journey you're about to go on.
Okay, so Jade says she works with many young people in schools. Do you have any advice about how to support peers in the class and wider school to understand, accept, and sensitively support a young person with tics?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good question. It's such a difficult thing for loads of children and young people who either their tics are quite distracting for others, or they're trying to hold them in, or people don't understand them, and people might accidentally be doing things which are kind of increasing and perpetuating the tic. So I will always encourage a kind of a whole school education approach. So finding a way to do an awareness day or an awareness assembly or session, either led alongside the child or young person, or completely separate to them in a day that they're not even in school. So people are understanding this is what this condition is, and this is how we can support our peers with this condition. We have on our website, again, free to download, peer-to-peer presentations. We have teacher presentations. We have lesson plans about Tourette syndrome for all different key stage areas. So we're currently right in the middle of Tourette's Awareness Month. It's the 15th of May to the 15th of June, and lots of schools, lots of groups, clubs, organisations use this as a time to do a bit of an awareness day, have an assembly, maybe do a fundraiser, watch some videos around it, increase awareness to make a safer and more supported space for their peer. Because essentially the general rule is we don't want to be bringing loads of attention to the tics when they happen. I mean, some tics do demand or require a response, and some tics almost naturally create a response because we're humans, and that's absolutely fine. But generally, we kind of want to let tics be. We want to normalize them, and just kind of let the individual with tics tic and not kind of overly focus on it where possible. So doing that kind of whole school approach can be really helpful. We have downloadable personalizable Tourette's passports where people can record their symptoms and their experience of Tourette's and how it might present, and that can be really helpful in school, especially with changing teachers, substitutes. You know, going into a substitute teacher and telling them you have Tourette's is almost like poking a bear, because the amount of time you just say, well, no, you don't, there's no way. And it's insane to me that people can even think that it's a joke, but because it's so widely used as a joke, people sometimes very incorrectly assume that someone isn't being truthful about their condition. So having those physical tools, visual markers of it, and having a whole school approach to help people to feel safe, to be them awesome, authentic, ticky, loud, proud selves in that space. That's what I'd say. Not every child and young person is going to feel comfortable with that. So have that kind of conversation, and ideally get that child or young person as involved in the process as possible, so it's representative of their experience. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I don't think we've got any other questions. No, we haven't. And to be honest, I think we've covered so much, or rather you have covered so much that usually I can think of lots of questions, but I think we've probably covered a lot of it, to be honest with you. That was absolutely fantastic. I am so pleased that we found each other on the panel for Neurodiversity Celebration Week. About, what was the panel about? Neurodivergent women, wasn't it?
That it was.
And we kind of swapped webinars, so that's really, really good. I will be putting this up on the YouTube channel because I did actually remember to press record, so that's really good. And I will add all of the links that Ione has sent me for the various things that she's mentioned that are on the Tourettes Action website. So all of those website links will go up on the description on the YouTube channel. Okay. Let everybody go and enjoy their lunch now, or whatever's happening. Go and get on with your work day, go and get on with your school day, whatever it might be. And thank you ever so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.